The rich man pushes his blind son into the frozen current and walks away without looking back. The boy struggles in the water. Suddenly, a white horse emerges from the fog and steps into the river, locking eyes with him. But before we go on, if you love animals as much as we do, subscribe to the channel so you never miss a heartfelt story. Thank you. Now, back to our story. The winter arrived early that year in the Montana wilderness, bringing with it a silence so profound it seemed to swallow even the most persistent sounds. Massive pines bent under the weight of snow, making the winding mountain trails nearly impossible to distinguish. The biting winds drove wildlife into caves and protected clearings, seeking shelter from the unforgiving cold. In one of the most isolated properties in the region, Harrison Wells, a man known equally for his wealth and his emotional detachment, prepared his luxury cabin for a season away from the city. For him, this wasn't a retreat, but an opportunity. The company he had chosen for this journey was his own son, Mason, a 12-year-old boy who had lost his sight to a degenerative condition when he was just months old. The relationship between father and son had always been marked by distance. Harrison, pragmatic and demanding, viewed his son's disability not as a challenge to overcome, but as a burden that might compromise the legacy he had worked so ruthlessly to build. Mason's mother, Eliza, had left years ago, unable to bear Harrison's coldness toward their son. Since then, the boy had lived under the care of housekeepers and instructors, receiving lessons and supervision, but never affection. Despite this emotional drought, Mason had developed a rare sensitivity and a special connection with the animals on their property, especially with a white horse named Avalanche, who, for reasons beyond logical explanation, seemed to understand the boy on a level that transcended ordinary communication. "We're almost there," Harrison announced, his voice cutting through the rhythmic hum of the Range Rover's engine as they climbed the final stretch of private road leading to the cabin. His words weren't meant to comfort or excite his son, but merely to state a fact. Mason nodded, his fingers absently tracing the contours of his jacket zipper. "Does it still look the same?" he asked, his voice soft but clear. Harrison glanced at his son, momentarily caught off guard by the question. Mason had been 8 the last time they'd visited, when his sight had already been gone for years. "Everything looks the same," Harrison replied flatly. "The mountains don't change." The cabin came into view as they rounded the final bend, a sprawling structure of timber and stone that rose from the snowy landscape like a declaration of human dominance over nature. It was precisely what Harrison valued, a statement of control. As the vehicle came to a stop, the caretaker, Jim Colson, emerged from a smaller building nearby. A weathered man in his 60s with a perpetual furrow between his brows, Jim had maintained the property for 15 years. He approached with his usual efficient stride. "Mr. Wells," he nodded respectfully, then his expression softened slightly. "And young Master Mason, welcome back." "Hello, Mr. Colson," Mason replied, his face turning toward the sound of the caretakers. A voice with unerring accuracy. "Is Avalanche still here?" Jim's weather-beaten face broke into a genuine smile. "Sure is. Been waiting for you, I'd say. That horse perks up every time a vehicle comes up the road, like he's expecting someone special." For the first time since their departure from the city, a small smile found its way to Mason's face. Harrison observed this exchange with veiled displeasure, noting the ease with which his son connected with others, an ability he himself had never mastered nor particularly valued. "Luggage first, horses later," Harrison interjected, already moving toward the trunk. The cabin interior greeted them with the scent of pine and the subtle warmth of radiant floor heating. Harrison had called ahead to ensure everything would be prepared. The kitchen stocked, the generator checked, the satellite internet connected. Nothing was left to chance or improvisation. Mason moved cautiously through the entryway, his right hand extended slightly, fingertips reading the space around him with a practiced touch. "Your room is upstairs, same as before," Harrison said, setting down his laptop case. "Jim's wife, Sarah, organized it for you. She remembered how you had things last time." Mason nodded, grateful for Sarah's consideration. He'd spent 3 days during their last visit arranging his room to create a mental map he could navigate confidently. "Thank you. May I go see Avalanche now?" Harrison checked his watch, a habit more related to maintaining control than actual time constraints. "Dinner is at 7. Be back and cleaned up by then." With that permission granted, Mason carefully made his way to the coat rack, retrieved his jacket, and headed for the door. He'd memorized the 15 steps from the main entrance to the porch stairs, the right turn at the bottom, and the 123 steps to the stable. His white cane swept methodically before him, reading the terrain with light taps. The stable was a modern structure that matched the cabin's architectural style, housing 4 stalls, though only 2 were currently occupied. As Mason approached, a soft nickering greeted him, a sound that created a small pool of warmth in his chest that had nothing to do with the temperature. "Avalanche," he called softly. The response was immediate, the shuffle of hooves on straw, the gentle thud of a powerful body moving toward the stall door. Mason reached the entrance and extended his hand, palm flat. A velvet soft muzzle pressed against it, followed by a warm exhalation that misted in the cold air. "I told Dad I remembered the way," Mason said, his fingers finding the horse's cheek, then moving up to scratch behind an ear. "But I really remembered. Your smell, pine shavings, and that apple conditioner Sarah uses on your mane." Avalanche stood perfectly still, allowing the boys careful exploration. The horse was large for a boy of Mason's size, 16 hands of muscled power with a coat. So white it seemed to capture and hold what little light penetrated the stable's interior. Unlike the nervous energy many horses exhibited, Avalanche possessed a stillness that seemed almost deliberate in Mason's presence, as if the animal understood the importance of being predictable for someone who lived in darkness. "They've got me in the same room as last time," Mason continued, his small fingers working through the tangles in Avalanche's mane. "Dad's going to be working a lot," he says. "Something about a deal he needs to finish before the year ends." He paused, his expression momentarily uncertain. "I think that's really why we're here, so he can work without distractions." Avalanche nickered softly, nudging the boy's shoulder. "Yeah, I know," Mason smiled, interpreting the gesture as agreement. "But that's okay, because it means I get to spend time with you." From the stable entrance, Jim Colson watched the interaction, his expression a mixture of tenderness and concern. He'd cared for enough animals and encountered enough people to recognize the special bond between the boy and the horse. More troubling to the caretaker was what he'd observed over the years in Harrison Wells, a coldness that went beyond mere emotional reserve. There was something calculating in the way the man regarded his own son, something that had always left Jim uneasy. As light snow began to fall outside, casting the landscape in deepening blue shadow, Jim made a silent promise to keep a closer eye on young Mason during this visit. Something in his gut, the same instinct that had warned him of approaching storms throughout his life in these mountains, told him this winter might bring more than just snow and cold. Inside the main cabin, Harrison Wells stood at the window of his study, watching his son's distant figure by the stable. His expression remained impassive as he lifted a crystal tumbler of bourbon to his lips. The amber liquid burned pleasantly as he contemplated the weeks ahead. He had plans, significant ones, that would finally allow him to move forward unburdened. The isolation of the property, the early winter, the lack of visitors, all these factors had been carefully considered. "Everything in its time," he murmured, to the empty room, raising his glass in a solitary toast before turning back to his laptop. On the screen, an insurance policy document glowed with quiet menace in the growing darkness of the Montana afternoon. During the first week at the cabin, Mason established a careful routine. He woke with the first light. Not that he could see it, but years of practice had aligned his internal clock with the rhythms of nature. Breakfast was a quiet affair with his father, filled with the clink of silverware and the rustle of Harrison turning pages on his tablet. By mid-morning, Harrison would retreat to his study, leaving Mason to the company of audiobooks or, when Jim was available to supervise, visits to the stable. "Dad says you're getting old," Mason said to Avalanche one crisp morning as he brushed the horse's coat with long, methodical strokes. The stable smelled of hay and leather, with the sharp undercut of winter air flowing through the partially open door. "But Jim says you're just distinguished. That's a fancy way of saying you've earned your age." Avalanche responded with a gentle nudge to Mason's shoulder, nearly knocking the boy off his perch on an overturned bucket. "Careful," laughed Sarah Coulson as she entered the stable carrying a small basket. In her mid-50s, Sarah had a warmth that seemed to radiate from her, making her voice sound like it was always on the verge of sharing something wonderful. "That horse has more manners than most people I know. He's just telling you he agrees with Jim." Mason turned toward her voice, smiling. "Hi, Mrs. Coulson. What's that smell?" "Fresh oatmeal cookies. Thought you might like a mid-morning snack, and there's an apple for your friend there." She placed the basket on a nearby shelf and ruffled Mason's hair, a gesture so natural and affectionate that it highlighted how rarely the boy received such touches. "Thank you," Mason said, setting down the brush and reaching for the basket. With unerring precision, his heightened senses of smell and hearing had mapped the small area perfectly. "Dad doesn't allow many sweets at home." Sarah made a small sound that might have been disapproval, but was too polite to be labeled as such. "Growing boys need a little sweetness now and then. Your father works so hard. Sometimes I think he forgets there's more to life than success." Mason broke off a piece of cookie and considered her words. "He says I need to learn discipline since I'll have to work twice as hard as everyone else." The silence that followed carried a weight of things Sarah wanted to say, but wouldn't. Instead, she watched as Mason offered the apple to Avalanche, holding it flat on his palm, the way Jim had taught him years earlier. The horse's lips carefully and collected the fruit, deliberately gentle with the boy. "That horse," Sarah said, her voice softening. "Jim says he's never seen anything like it. Horses are usually skittish creatures, but Avalanche seems to know exactly how to behave around you." Mason nodded, wiping his palm on his jeans after the apple was taken. "He listens differently, not just to sounds, but to—" The boy paused, struggling to find the right words. "To the quiet parts, the parts people don't say out loud." Sarah studied the boy, struck by the wisdom in his observation. At 12, Mason possessed an emotional intelligence that many adults, including his father, never achieved. She opened her mouth to respond when the stable door opened wider, sending a shaft of winter sunlight across the straw-covered floor. "Mrs. Coulson." Harrison Wells stood in the doorway, his figure backlit by the bright snow outside. "I wasn't aware you'd be here today." His tone wasn't accusatory, but it carried an edge of ownership over the property, the schedule, and by extension, his son's time. "Just dropping off a snack for Mason, Mr. Wells," Sarah replied, her friendly tone unwavering despite the sudden tension in her shoulders. "He's been helping with Avalanche's grooming." Harrison stepped into the stable, his polished Italian leather boots incongruous against the rustic setting. "I see, Mason. I need to drive into town for a conference call at the local satellite office. Poor connection at the cabin. You'll stay with the Coulsons until I return this evening." It wasn't a question, but an arrangement already decided. Mason nodded, his fingers still working through Avalanche's mane, finding the tangles with practiced precision. "Of course, Mr. Wells," Sarah said. We'd love to have Mason for the day. Jim's making his venison stew. It's become a tradition when Mason visits. Something flickered across Harrison's face, perhaps annoyance at the presumption of traditions he hadn't authorized, or possibly discomfort at the evidence of connections his son had formed independently. Whatever it was, it vanished quickly, behind his composed exterior. I'll be back by 8. Make sure he completes 2 hours of his audio lessons. With that, Harrison turned and left, the crunch of his footsteps on snow fading into the winter quiet. Sarah exhaled slowly. "Well then," she said, her cheerfulness returning, "looks like you're stuck with us for the day, young man." The Coulsons' cottage sat a quarter-mile from the main cabin, close enough for caretaking duties, but far enough to give both employer and employees their privacy. It was a sturdy, single-story building with riverstone foundations and walls of local timber. Inside, warmth emanated from a wood stove that Jim kept fed with split logs throughout the cold months. "There he is," Jim called as Sarah led Mason through the front door. The old caretaker stood at the kitchen counter, a worn apron protecting his flannel shirt as he chopped vegetables, just in time to help with lunch preparations. Mason's face lit up at the familiar voice and the rich aroma of simmering broth. "What can I do?" he asked eagerly. "These carrots need peeling," Jim replied, pulling out a stool at the counter. "Sarah says you've got the steadiest hands she's ever seen." The next few hours passed in comfortable domesticity. Mason peeled carrots and potatoes with careful concentration, his fingers moving with remarkable dexterity. Jim told stories of his younger days as a park ranger, of bears encountered and hikers rescued, while Sarah added details he'd forgotten or embellished with her gentle teasing. The stew bubbled on the stove, filling the cottage with savory aromas that made Mason realize how hungry he was. "Your dad seems especially busy this trip," Jim commented as they sat down to eat. The observation was casual, but the glance he exchanged with Sarah carried unspoken concern. Mason nodded, his spoon finding the bowl without difficulty. "He's finalizing a big acquisition. He says it'll change everything." The boy paused, then added, "He's been making a lot of phone calls when he thinks I'm asleep." Sarah and Jim exchanged another look. "What kind of calls?" Sarah asked, her voice carefully neutral. Mason shrugged. "Business stuff, insurance questions, something about policy details and verification of information." He took a bite of stew, savoring the rich flavor. "This is amazing, Mr. Coulson." Jim accepted the compliment with a grunt, but his mind had caught on the word insurance. After 30 years in these mountains, he'd developed a sixth sense for trouble, and something about Harrison Wells's behavior this visit had triggered that internal alarm. "Your dad mentioned taking you exploring soon," Jim said, watching Mason's expression closely. "Any idea where?" Mason shook his head. "He just said he wants to show me more of the property, maybe near the river." The spoon in Jim's hand paused halfway to his mouth. The river was treacherous this time of year, partially frozen, but with deadly currents running beneath the ice. No experienced local would venture there with a child, especially not one who couldn't see. "If you go anywhere near water, you make." "Sure, I'm with you," Jim said, his voice firmer than Mason had ever heard it. That river's no place for anyone this time of year." Mason nodded, slightly confused by the sudden seriousness. "Okay, Mr. Coulson." Later, after Mason had been settled in the guest room with his audio lessons, Jim pulled Sarah into the kitchen, his voice low with urgency. "I don't like it, Sarah. Something's off. Wells has never shown interest in exploring with the boy before." Sarah twisted a dish towel in her hands. "Maybe he's finally trying to bond with his son." Jim shook his head. "Man doesn't suddenly develop paternal instincts at 48. And there's all this talk of insurance and policy verification." He ran a weathered hand through his grey hair. "Last week, I found him studying maps of the property, specifically the eastern section by the river gorge. What are you thinking? Jim? Sarah's voice had dropped to a whisper, though Mason was in the other room with headphones on. I'm thinking we need to keep a closer eye on things, Jim replied. And I'm thinking I might take Avalanche out for exercise along that eastern trail tomorrow morning, just to check things out. The light was fading when Harrison's Range Rover pulled up to the Coulsons' cottage. Mason gathered his things, thanked Sarah for the cookies she'd packed for him, and promised Jim he'd help with stable chores the next day. Remember what I said about the river? Jim reminded him as he walked the boy to the vehicle. I will, Mason promised, his free hand gripping his white cane. Harrison nodded curtly to Jim as he opened the passenger door for his son. The caretaker's presence seemed to irritate him more than usual. Everything goes smoothly? Harrison asked as they drove the short distance back to the main cabin. Yes, sir, Mason replied, slipping into the more formal address he used when sensing his father's mood was particularly rigid. I completed the lessons on American history and pre-algebra. Harrison made a sound of acknowledgement, but offered no praise. As they approached the cabin, he said, I've been thinking we should explore more of the property. Tomorrow, perhaps. There's a place by the river I think you might find interesting. In the failing light, neither father nor son noticed the figure of Jim Coulson watching from the doorway of his cottage, his expression grim as the Range Rover disappeared around the bend in the driveway. That night, as a heavy snow began to fall, 3 minds remained awake in the darkness of the Montana wilderness. In the main cabin, Harrison sat at his desk, reviewing documents on his laptop, the glow illuminating his face with cold blue light as he methodically finalized details. In the guest room, Mason lay listening to the soft patter of snow against his window, his thoughts drifting to Avalanche and the comfort of the horse's steady presence. And in their cottage, Jim Coulson stood at his own window, watching the snow obscure the landscape, his instincts for approaching danger, honed by decades in the wilderness, urging him toward vigilance as the night deepened around them all. Morning arrived with the hushed quality that only comes after a heavy snowfall. The world seemed wrapped in cotton, muffling even the most persistent sounds. Mason woke to the gentle knock of Sarah Coulson at his bedroom door, her voice carrying a cheerfulness that didn't quite mask her concern. Breakfast is ready, Mason, your father asked. Me to help you get ready for your outing today. Mason sat up, orienting himself to the room's dimensions with the practiced efficiency of someone who has lived in darkness. Is it still snowing, Mrs. Coulson? Stopped about an hour ago, she replied, setting clothes on the end of his bed. Left about 8 inches of fresh powder, though. Your father says you're going exploring, so I've laid out your warmest things. Mason nodded, swinging his legs over the side of the bed. Dad mentioned the river yesterday. Sarah's hands paused as she arranged his thick socks. Did he now? Her voice remained steady, but something in it changed, a tightening that Mason's sensitive hearing detected immediately. Jim mentioned that too, said the river's dangerous this time of year. Dad said he wants to show me something interesting. There. Sarah smoothed the quilt beside him, choosing her words carefully. Mason, your father, he sometimes has different ideas about what's best. If anything feels wrong today, you trust that feeling, you hear me? And remember what Jim taught you about staying warm if you get wet in cold weather. The unusual seriousness in her tone caused Mason to turn his face toward her, his unseeing eyes somehow finding her with uncanny precision. Mrs. Coulson, is something wrong? She hesitated, then squeezed his shoulder. Probably not. Jim just worries, and it's rubbed off on me over the years. She stood up. Come down when you're dressed. I've made blueberry pancakes, your favorite. Downstairs, Harrison Wells sat at the dining table, reviewing documents on his tablet, barely acknowledging Sarah as she refilled his coffee cup. His expression was focused, almost detached, as if his mind were already elsewhere. Calculating, planning. Sarah, he said suddenly, causing her to startle slightly. I won't need dinner prepared tonight. Mason and I will have a late lunch during our outing. Sarah nodded, though her lips pressed into a thin line. Of course, Mr. Wells. Though Jim mentioned the weather report calls for another storm system moving in this afternoon. Might be safer to stay closer to the cabin. Harrison's eyes flickered up to her, cold and assessing. I appreciate the concern, but I've checked the forecasts. We'll be fine. His tone made it clear the matter was settled. When Mason came downstairs, he was dressed in layers of thermal clothing under a heavy snow jacket. His white cane tapped a careful path to the dining table, where the scent of blueberry pancakes guided him to his place. Eat quickly, Harrison instructed, not looking up. From his tablet, I want to get an early start before the next weather front moves in. Mason nodded, his fork finding the pancakes with practiced ease. Are we taking Avalanche? He asked, hope evident in his voice. For the first time that morning, Harrison's expression changed slightly, a brief tightening around the eyes that might have been irritation. Yes, the terrain is difficult with the fresh snow. The horse will make it easier to navigate certain areas. Sarah, wiping down the kitchen counter, shot a glance at Harrison's back. Something in his response had triggered her internal alarm, the same instinct that had helped her survive 3 decades in the harsh Montana wilderness. She slipped quietly from the room, pulling her cell phone from her pocket as she stepped onto the back porch. Jim answered on the first ring. Sarah? They're heading to the river, she said without preamble, her breath fogging in the cold air. With Avalanche. I'm already there, Jim replied, his voice muffled by wind. Been checking the eastern trail since dawn. Something doesn't sit right, Sarah. Wells has been making calls about insurance payouts and inquiring about grief counseling services in town. Sarah's free hand pressed against her mouth. Jim, you don't think... I don't know what to think, he cut in. But I'm staying out here. Which path are they taking? He didn't say, but he's bringing the horse. That's something at least. Avalanche has more sense than most people. Keep your phone on, Sarah. I'll check in every 30 minutes. After disconnecting, Sarah returned to find Harrison helping Mason with his gloves, an unusual display of attention that only increased her unease. The boy's face was animated with excitement at the prospect of an adventure with both his father and Avalanche, unaware of the adult's silent concerns. All set? Harrison asked, his voice carrying an unfamiliar enthusiasm that struck Sarah as performative. I've packed some sandwiches and hot chocolate in a thermos. Mason nodded eagerly. All set. Harrison turned to Sarah. We'll be back before dark. No need to wait around. It was a dismissal, but Sarah stood her ground. I'll be here getting dinner started anyway, Mr. Wells, just in case your plans change. Something like annoyance flickered across Harrison's face, but he merely nodded and guided Mason toward the door. Outside, the world was transformed into a landscape of pristine white. The sun reflected blindingly off the snow, creating a brightness that Mason could perceive only as a faint warmth on his face. Harrison led him toward the stable, where Avalanche was already saddled and waiting, his white coat nearly invisible against the snowy backdrop. Hello, Avalanche, Mason called, reaching out. The horse responded immediately, stretching his neck. To meet the boy's outstretched hand, the animal's breath created warm clouds in the frigid air. I'll help you mount, Harrison said, lifting Mason with surprising gentleness. Once the boy was settled in the saddle, Harrison took the reins and began leading them away from the cabin, following a trail that wound through the pine forest toward the eastern property line. The journey was mostly silent, punctuated only by Harrison occasionally pointing out landscape features, descriptions that meant little to Mason, but which he appreciated nonetheless as rare attempts at connection from his father. The trail gradually sloped downward, and the sound of their progress changed, the soft crunch of snow giving way to harder impacts as the path became more rocky and steep. "We're approaching the river," Harrison announced after nearly an hour of walking. "Can you hear it?" Mason tilted his head, focusing his acute hearing. Beneath the whisper of wind through pine needles and the occasional crack of snow falling from branches, he detected it. A low, persistent, rushing sound. "Yes, it sounds angry." Harrison made a sound that might have been appreciation. "Good description. The Blackwater River is partially frozen this time of year. Ice forms along the edges and in calm pools, but the main channel still flows beneath, fast and cold." They continued downward, Harrison leading Avalanche carefully along the increasingly treacherous path. The horse moved with surprising confidence despite the difficult terrain, seeming to understand the precious cargo he carried. Mason held the saddle horn with one hand, his other resting lightly on Avalanche's neck, drawing comfort from the animal's warmth and steady rhythm. The sound of the river grew louder, its rumble echoing off the rocky ravine they were descending into. The air grew noticeably colder as they approached the water, carrying the mineral scent of wet stone and the sharp edge of ice. "We're here," Harrison announced, bringing Avalanche to a halt. "This is what I wanted to show you." Mason listened intently, creating a mental image from the sounds around him. The river churned below, its surface occasionally cracking as ice fragments collided. Wind whistled through the narrow gorge, creating ghostly harmonics that raised goosebumps on his arms despite his layers. "It's beautiful," Mason said, though beautiful wasn't quite the word that formed in his mind. Powerful might have been more accurate, or dangerous. "Indeed," Harrison replied, his voice taking on an odd quality, distant yet focused. "This part of the river has claimed many lives over the years. The currents are unpredictable, and the water is so cold that even strong swimmers lose consciousness within minutes." Something in his father's tone caused Mason to stiffen slightly in the saddle. Avalanche seemed to sense the change, shifting his weight restlessly. "I think Avalanche is getting nervous," Mason said, patting the horse's neck. "Maybe we should move back from the edge." Harrison didn't respond immediately. When he did, his voice had returned to its usual businesslike tone. "Let's have lunch first. There's a flat area just ahead that offers an excellent view of the gorge." He led them forward, stopping in what felt to Mason like a more exposed position. The wind was stronger here, and the river sound reflected differently, suggesting an open area. "Wait here," Harrison instructed, helping Mason dismount. "I'll get the food from the saddlebag." Mason stood still, his white cane probing the ground around him. The surface felt hard-packed, yet slippery, perhaps ice covered by a thin layer of snow. The realization sent a jolt of unease through him. Avalanche nickered softly beside him, the horse's warm breath brushing against his cheek. Behind him, Mason heard his father's footsteps moving away from the saddlebag, circling around until they stopped several feet behind him. There was a moment of complete stillness, only the rush of the river below and the slight shifting of Avalanche's hooves breaking the silence. "Dad?" Mason called, turning slightly toward where he believed his father stood. "You?" "No, Mason," Harrison said, his voice now completely devoid of the earlier fabricated warmth. "I've often wondered what life might have been like with a son who could carry on my legacy properly." A cold that had nothing to do with the winter. Air settled in Mason's stomach. "What do you mean?" "Insurance policies are interesting things," Harrison continued as if Mason hadn't spoken, "especially those with specific clauses about accidental death in remote locations." Mason took a step backward, his cane feeling for secure footing. "Dad, you're scaring me." "That's always been the problem, hasn't it?" Harrison's voice hardened. "Fear. Your mother coddled you, taught you to use your disability as an excuse. But business, real business, requires seeing clearly, something you'll never do." The implications of his father's words crashed over Mason with terrible clarity. He took another step back, but his cane found only empty air. The edge of the ravine was closer than he'd realized. "Please," Mason whispered, genuine fear making his voice quaver. Whatever I've done wrong. This isn't about wrong, Harrison cut in, his footsteps advancing slowly. It's about practicality. The company needs a true heir, not a burden. This way is cleaner for everyone. A tragic accident in the wilderness? Sad, but these things happen. Mason's heart hammered in his chest as he realized what was about to occur. He opened his mouth to call for help, knowing no one was near enough to hear, when a sudden, heavy impact against his side sent him sprawling sideways onto the snow-covered ground. For a confused moment, he thought his father had already pushed him, but then he felt the unmistakable presence of Avalanche standing protectively over him, the horse's body forming a barrier between Mason and Harrison. "Get away, you stupid animal!" Harrison shouted, his composure breaking for the first time. Avalanche responded with a threatening snort, his hooves stamping the ground in warning. Mason scrambled backwards, away from where he believed the edge to be, his hands finding purchase in the snow. The sound of his father's angry approach was met with more aggressive behavior from Avalanche, the horse rearing slightly, forelegs pawing the air. "Dad, stop!" Mason cried out. "Please!" But Harrison was beyond reasoning. In his mind, the careful plan he'd constructed was unraveling, and the fury of that realization drove him forward. He lunged toward the horse, attempting to push past the animal to reach Mason. What happened next occurred with such speed that Mason could only piece it together through the chaotic sounds. Avalanche's panicked whinny, his father's startled shout, a scrabbling of boots on ice, and then, most terrifying of all, the sound of something heavy breaking through ice, followed by a splash and a strangled cry that was abruptly cut short. "Dad?" Mason called, his voice small against the suddenly deafening rush of the river. "Dad!" Only the water answered, its churning unaltered by the life it had just claimed. Mason sat frozen in the snow, shock temporarily overriding all other emotions. Avalanche moved to his side, nudging him gently with his muzzle. The warmth of the horse's breath, the only reality in a world that had just tilted on its axis. The sound of someone crashing through underbrush broke through Mason's daze. "Mason!" a familiar voice shouted. "Mason, where are you?" "Mr. Coulson!" Mason called back weakly. "Over here, by the edge!" Jim Coulson appeared moments later, his breath coming in ragged gasps from his headlong rush down the ravine path. "Mason!" Thank God. He knelt beside the boy, hands quickly checking for injuries. "Are you hurt? Where's your father?" Mason could only point toward the river, his hand trembling violently. He fell. Avalanche tried to protect me, and Dad got too. Close to the edge, the ice broke. Jim rose immediately, moving cautiously toward the ravine edge. Mason heard him calling Harrison's name repeatedly, each call more desperate than the last. After what seemed an eternity, Jim returned to Mason's side. "The current's too strong," he said, his voice grave but steady, "and the water temperature." He left the sentence unfinished, instead focusing on the immediate need. "We need to get you warm and safe. Can you stand?" Mason nodded numbly, allowing Jim to help him to his feet. The reality of what had happened hadn't fully registered yet. His mind seemed to be operating at a distance, observing events rather than experiencing them. "Avalanche saved me," he said as Jim helped him toward the horse. "Dad was going to push me in. He said something about insurance policies and accidents in remote locations." Jim's hands stilled momentarily on Mason's jacket. "Christ," he muttered, then more loudly, "let's get you on Avalanche. The path back is too treacherous for you to walk, and we need to move quickly. Another storm is coming in." As if confirming his words, the wind picked up, carrying the first flakes of new snow. Jim lifted Mason onto Avalanche's back, then mounted behind him, one arm securely around the boy's waist. "Hold tight to the saddle horn," Jim instructed. Avalanche knows this trail better than most humans. He'll get us home safely. As they began the ascent from the ravine, Mason leaned against Jim's solid presence, the shock of the past hour beginning to give way to tremors that had nothing to do with the cold. Avalanche moved with deliberate care, choosing each step with precision despite the deteriorating weather conditions. "Did you know?" Mason finally asked, his voice small against the rising wind, "about what Dad was planning?" Jim's arm tightened protectively around him. "Not for certain, but Sarah and I had concerns. That's why I was checking the river trail this morning." His voice roughened with emotion. "I should have gotten there sooner." "It's not your fault," Mason said. "You couldn't have known exactly when." He couldn't finish the sentence, the reality still too raw to articulate. They rode in silence after that, the storm building around them as they made their way back toward the cabin. The snowfall intensified, reducing visibility and muffling sounds until it seemed they were moving through a world composed entirely of white. Through it all, Avalanche continued forward with unwavering confidence, his strength and warmth the one constant in Mason's suddenly shattered world. By the time the lights of the cabin came into view, the storm had reached blizzard proportions. Sarah Coulson stood on the porch, her figure barely visible through the swirling snow. As they approached, she ran forward to meet them, her face etched with worry that deepened when she saw only 2 riders on Avalanche's back. "Inside," Jim called, over the howling wind. "We need to get him warm first. I'll explain everything." Sarah nodded, rushing ahead to open the door. As Jim helped Mason dismount, the boy turned to press his face against Avalanche's neck, his arms wrapping as far as they could reach around. "The horse. Thank you," he whispered into the white mane, now crusted with ice and snow. "You saved my life." Avalanche stood perfectly still for that brief embrace, then gently nudged Mason toward the cabin, as if understanding the urgency of getting the boy to safety. Jim led Mason up the porch steps, but paused before entering. "The stables too. Far in this storm," he said to Sarah. "Help me get Mason inside and settled, then I'll bring Avalanche into the garage for the night. That horse has earned a warm, dry place." As they guided Mason into the warmth of the cabin, the howling storm encircled the property, erasing their tracks and gradually burying all signs of the day's events beneath an endless blanket of white. Somewhere far below, the Blackwater River continued its relentless flow, carrying its secrets toward distant, unknowable destinations. The storm raged for 2 days, imprisoning them in the cabin with its furious intensity. Snow piled against the windows, transforming the glass into translucent walls that admitted light, but revealed nothing of the world beyond. Inside, Mason moved through a fog of shock and confusion, his young mind struggling to process the events. By the river, the adults spoke in hushed tones when they thought he couldn't hear, their conversations a mixture of practical concerns and moral outrage. "Search and rescue can't get through until the storm breaks," Jim reported after his latest call to the county sheriff's office. "Even then, with the conditions on the river, they probably won't find him," Sarah finished, her voice heavy with the knowledge that Harrison Wells would likely remain another of the Blackwater's unclaimed victims. Mason sat near the fireplace, his fingers absently tracing the contours of a mug of hot chocolate that had long since gone cold. Despite the warmth of the room, he couldn't seem to shake the chill that had settled deep in his bones. It wasn't just the physical cold from their ordeal by the river, it was something deeper, a fundamental reordering of his understanding of the world and his place in it. "He really was going to do it," he said suddenly, breaking the heavy silence. "He was going to push me." Sarah and Jim exchanged a glance, their expressions mirroring each other's helplessness. Sarah moved to sit beside Mason, her hand gently covering his. "Sometimes," she began carefully, "people get so caught up in what they think matters, money, success, appearances, that they lose sight of what actually does matter. But I'm his son," Mason said, the words barely audible. Jim knelt in front of the boy, his weathered hands resting on Mason's knees. "Mason, listen to me. What happened out there, what your father tried to do, that's on him, not you. It was never about you not being enough. It was about him not being able to see how extraordinary you are." Mason's unseeing eyes filled with tears that spilled onto his cheeks. "How can I be extraordinary? I can't even see. I can't do most things other kids can do." "That's where you're wrong," Sarah said firmly. "You navigate this world with more courage than most people who have all their senses intact. You connect with animals in a way that's almost magical. You listen, really listen, when most people just wait for their turn to talk." She squeezed his hand. "Those aren't small things, Mason. Those are rare gifts." In the garage converted to temporary stable, Avalanche shifted restlessly, his hooves making soft sounds on the concrete floor covered with hay. The horse had been agitated since their return, as if sensing the emotional turmoil in the house. Jim had checked on him regularly, ensuring he had fresh water and plenty of feed, but the animal remained alert, his ears constantly perked toward the cabin. "I need to see Avalanche," Mason said suddenly, setting down his mug and standing. "It's almost bedtime," Sarah began, then stopped herself. The usual rules seemed trivial in the face of what they'd all experienced. "All right, but bundle up, it's freezing in the garage." Wrapped in a thick coat, with Sarah guiding him across the snow-cleared path, Mason approached the garage. The moment Jim opened the side door, Avalanche nickered a greeting, the sound carrying such distinct recognition that even Sarah was startled by it. "He knows your footsteps," Jim observed, as Mason moved confidently toward the horse, one hand extended. "Been on edge all day, but calms right down when you're near." Mason reached Avalanche and leaned against the horse's solid warmth, his arms wrapping around the strong neck. The familiar scent, hay, and that special apple conditioner Sarah used enveloped him, bringing the first real sense of security he'd felt since the river. "He keeps saving me," Mason whispered, his face pressed into the white mane. Jim and Sarah exchanged a glance over the boy's head, a silent communication born of decades together. Jim nodded slightly, and Sarah slipped out, returning to the warmth of the cabin. "You know," Jim said, settling on an overturned bucket nearby, "some people believe animals can see things we can't, not just with their eyes, but with something deeper." Mason turned his face toward Jim's voice, his expression thoughtful. "Like what?" "Like the truth about people, the parts they hide from everyone else." Jim reached for a brush and handed it to Mason. "When I was a park ranger, I worked with a search and rescue dog, a border collie named Max. That dog could track a lost hiker through anything, rain, snow, whatever. But there was this one time—" He paused, listening to the rhythmic sound of Mason brushing Avalanche's coat. "This one time, we were called to find a man who'd gone missing on a fishing trip. His wife was frantic, said he'd never stayed out overnight before." Mason continued brushing, but Jim could tell he was listening intently. "We tracked him to this cabin by a remote lake. When Max found him, you know what that man was doing? Sitting on a porch with another woman laughing. Turned out he'd been living a double life for years." Jim shook his head at the memory. His wife was genuinely worried, but Max, that dog, took one look at the man and just sat down, wouldn't approach him. It was like he could see the dishonesty. "You think Avalanche saw something in my father?" Mason asked. Jim considered this. "I think Avalanche saw something in you worth protecting. And maybe he saw that your father had lost his way so completely that he couldn't recognize the treasure he had in his own son." Mason's hands stilled on Avalanche's coat. "What's going to happen to me now?" The question hung in the air, heavy with the uncertainty of a 12-year-old boy suddenly facing a future without moorings. "First things first," Jim said, his voice carrying a reassuring steadiness. "The authorities will come once the storm breaks. There will be questions, investigations, but Sarah and I will be right there with you through all of it." And after that? Jim sighed. Your mother needs to be notified. Do you know where she is? Mason nodded. Dad's lawyer sometimes arranged for me to talk to her on the phone. She's living in Seattle now. Something like hope flickered in Jim's chest. Perhaps the boy's mother would step forward, reclaim the role that circumstances or Harrison Wells's manipulations had forced her to abandon. Then that's where we'll start, Jim said, standing and placing a hand on Mason's shoulder. One day at a time, son. That's how we've always managed in these mountains. The storm broke on the morning of the third day, retreating like a spent army, leaving behind a transformed landscape of pristine white drifts and diamond-bright sunlight. With the roads still impassable, the county sheriff dispatched search and rescue teams on snowmobiles, their arrival breaking the isolated quiet that had enveloped the property. What followed was a blur of official questions, careful statements, and hushed consultations. Mason recounted the events by the river multiple times, each retelling draining him further, until Sarah finally put her foot down, insisting the boy needed rest. The search team spent hours combing the river gorge, but as predicted, found no trace of Harrison Wells. The treacherous currents and sub-zero water temperatures left little hope of recovery until the spring thaw, if then. We've contacted your mother, Mason, Sheriff Eleanor Blackwell informed him on the evening of the fourth day. A tall woman, with silver-streaked black hair and kind eyes that had seen too much of human suffering, she sat across from Mason at the cabin's dining table. She's flying in tomorrow. The highway crews have cleared the main roads, so we'll be able to bring her here. Mason's hands twisted in his lap. Is she? Does she want to see me? The sheriff's expression softened, though Mason couldn't see it. Son, she was on a plane within 2 hours of my call. Some things you don't need to question. After the sheriff left, Mason retreated to the stable where Avalanche had been returned once the garage was needed for official vehicles. The horse greeted him with the same quiet recognition as always, seeming to understand the boy's need for silent companionship. My mom's coming tomorrow, Mason told the horse, stroking his neck. I haven't seen her, been with her, in almost 4 years. Dad always said she left because she couldn't handle having a blind son, but... He paused, the recent revelations. About his father casting doubt on everything he'd been told. I don't know what's true anymore. Avalanche nudged him gently, as if encouraging him to continue. What if she doesn't want me either? The fear that had been building since the sheriff's announcement finally found voice. What if she only feels obligated because of what happened? The horse responded by resting his head over Mason's shoulder, a gesture so like an embrace that the boy found himself wrapping his arms around Avalanche's neck, drawing strength from the animal's steady presence. They remained that way until Sarah came to bring Mason in for dinner, her voice gentle as she called to him from the stable entrance. Your mother will be here before noon tomorrow, she said, as they walked back to the cabin. Jim's preparing the guest room for her. That night, Mason lay awake long after the household had gone quiet, his mind racing with memories and anxieties. The last clear image he had of his mother, before his vision had failed completely, was of her kneeling before him, her face tear-streaked but determined, as she promised to always love him. He had been 8 years old, and within weeks his father had moved them across the country, explaining that Mommy needed space to figure things out. Now, with adult perspective applied to childhood memories, Mason wondered if his father had engineered that separation, if the same calculating mind that had planned an accident in the wilderness had also orchestrated the dissolution of his marriage when his wife became an obstacle. Morning brought clear skies and rising temperatures, the first hint of the January thaw that occasionally visited even these northern mountains. Mason dressed with particular care, his fingers checking and rechecking the buttons of his shirt, conscious that this day might reshape his entire future. "She's here," Jim announced shortly before noon, the sound of tires on the clearing driveway having alerted him before the actual arrival. "Sheriff Blackwell's bringing her up now." Mason stood in the center of the living room, his heart hammering so hard he was certain everyone could hear it. Sarah squeezed his shoulder reassuringly, then moved away as the front door opened, admitting a gust of cold air and the sound of hesitant footsteps. "Mason!" A woman's voice, familiar yet changed by years and distance, broke the silence. "Mom?" His own voice sounded small to his ears, childlike in its uncertainty. There was a soft gasp, then the rush of movement, and suddenly he was enveloped in arms that held him with desperate strength, surrounded by a scent that unlocked a flood of memories. Vanilla and something floral, the same perfume she had worn when he was small. "My baby," she whispered against his hair, her voice breaking. "My beautiful, brave boy. I've missed you so much." "You have?" The question escaped before he could stop it, carrying years of doubt. Eliza Wells drew back slightly, her hands framing his face. "Every single day, every hour," her voice caught. "They told me what happened, what your father tried to do. I should have fought harder, shouldn't have believed the lawyers when they said I had no case for custody." "It's not your fault," Mason interrupted, suddenly needing to reassure her. "Dad was... he could make people believe things that weren't true." A choked sound escaped her, half laugh, half sob. "Yes, he could, but I should have seen through it, should have known what he was capable of." "Mom!" "None of us saw it clearly," Jim said quietly, from where he and Sarah stood by the fireplace, giving mother and son as much privacy as the open room allowed. Not until it was almost too late. Eliza looked toward them, her arms still around. "Mason, the sheriff told me what you did. How you suspected something and were watching out for Mason. I can never repay you for that." Sarah shook her head. "It wasn't just us," she said, nodding toward the window that faced the stable. "That horse knew something was wrong before any of us did. Avalanche saved me," Mason explained. "He knocked me away from the edge and stood between me and Dad." Eliza's arms tightened around him. "Then I owe him my gratitude as well." She paused, seeming to gather her thoughts. "Mason, I know this is sudden, and you've been through something terrible, but I've made arrangements. I have a house in Seattle, near a school with an excellent program for visually impaired students. If you'd be willing to give me another chance." "You want me to come live with you?" Mason could hardly believe what he was hearing. "More than anything in the world," Eliza replied, her voice steady now with certainty. "But only if that's what you want too." For the first time since the river, Mason felt something like hope unfurling in his chest. "I'd like that," he said softly. Then with sudden urgency, "But what about Avalanche? Dad owns him, and now that Dad is..." He couldn't bring himself to finish the sentence. "Actually," Jim interjected, "that's not entirely accurate. Harrison transferred ownership of Avalanche to the property management company, our company, last year. Said the horse was getting too old for his daughter's equestrian competitions and wasn't worth shipping back east." The contempt in Jim's voice for such callous reasoning was barely concealed. "Sarah and I have been caring for him since." "So he belongs to you now?" Mason asked. Jim and Sarah exchanged a look. "Technically, yes," Sarah replied, "but we've been thinking..." She hesitated, looking to Jim for confirmation. "Avalanche isn't just any horse," Jim continued. "What he did for you, that kind of bond, doesn't happen by accident. We've talked about it, and if your mother agrees, we think Avalanche should go with you to Seattle." Mason's face lit up with such hope that Eliza found herself nodding before she'd even considered the practical implications. "Of course," she said. "We'll make it work. I have a small place now, but I've been looking at houses outside the city, places with a bit of land. We know some excellent stables in the Seattle area," Sarah offered, "places where Mason could visit regularly until you're settled somewhere that can accommodate a horse." As the adults began discussing logistics, Mason felt a lightness he hadn't experienced in years. The nightmare by the river would never fully fade. He knew that, but neither would it define the rest of his life. His mother wanted him. Avalanche would stay with him. And for the first time since losing his sight, the future seemed filled with possibilities rather than limitations. That afternoon, with his mother by his side, Mason led Avalanche around the cleared area of the property, introducing them properly. Eliza, who had grown up on a small farm in Oregon, approached the horse with confident respect, her hand extended flat the way Mason had shown her. "Thank you for protecting my son," she said to Avalanche, her voice carrying such sincere gratitude that Mason felt his throat tighten with emotion. Avalanche responded with a gentle nudge to her shoulder, the same gesture of acceptance he had always shown Mason. Eliza laughed, a sound Mason realized he had missed desperately without even knowing it. "I think he approves of me," she said, stroking the horse's neck. "He's a good judge of character," Mason replied with a smile. From the cabin porch, Jim and Sarah watched the three figures against the backdrop of snow-covered mountains, the white horse nearly invisible against the landscape, except where the sun caught his movement. There was something right about the scene, a harmony that had been missing during Harrison Wells's cold ownership of the property. "They'll be okay," Sarah said softly, leaning against her husband's solid shoulder. Jim nodded, his arm wrapping around her. "That boy has more strength than his father ever understood, and now he has people who see it, really see it." The investigation into Harrison Wells's disappearance continued for months, revealing financial irregularities and insurance fraud that painted a damning picture even without Mason's testimony about the events by the river. The corporate empire Wells had built was scrutinized by regulatory agencies, its foundations revealed to be as morally compromised as the man who had created it. By spring, when the Blackwater River finally surrendered his body, few were surprised by the medical examiner's conclusion of accidental drowning. Mason and Eliza settled into a renovated farmhouse on 5 acres, outside Seattle, with a small stable where Avalanche became the uncontested king of the property. The bond between boy and horse only deepened with time, each seemingly understanding the other in ways that transcended normal animal-human relationships. On warm afternoons, visitors to the property would often see them in the fenced pasture, the blindfolded woman and her son practicing the skills Jim Colson had taught them, navigating the world through senses beyond sight. "It helps me understand," Eliza explained to Mason's new orientation and mobility instructor, who had come to observe their techniques. "When I experience the world the way Mason does, even briefly, I learn how to be a better guide." The instructor, impressed by the innovative approach, asked if she could bring other parents to observe. Soon, what had begun as a personal journey became a small but significant movement, parents of visually impaired children gathering at the farmhouse to learn from Mason, Eliza, and in his own way, Avalanche. "The horse was the first one who really saw me," Mason explained to a group. One sunny afternoon in late spring, as Avalanche grazed peacefully nearby. "Not my blindness, not what I couldn't do, but what I could. Sometimes that's all anyone needs, someone who truly sees them." Each month, Jim and Sarah Colson would call with updates about the Montana property, which had been placed in a trust for Mason's benefit once Harrison's estate was settled. Each call ended the same way, with promises to visit soon and news about the weather and local events. But the most important connections had already been forged, bonds of love and protection that had proven stronger than greed, stronger than cruelty, stronger even than the Blackwater's merciless currents. One evening in early summer, as twilight stretched the shadows across the pasture, Mason sat on the porch steps, listening to the rhythmic sounds of Avalanche grazing nearby. His Mother moved around the kitchen inside, the domestic noises creating a backdrop of security that still felt new and precious. Mason. Eliza called from the doorway. Sarah Colson's on the phone. She says the hummingbirds have returned to the Montana cabin. Thought you'd want to know. Mason smiled, remembering the tiny, vibrating wings he could sometimes feel disturbing the air near his face on the cabin porch. "Tell her that means summer's really arrived," he called back. As his mother returned to the phone, Mason turned his face toward the pasture, where Avalanche had raised his head at the sound of their voices. In the gathering dusk, the white horse was a luminous presence, a guardian who had once stood between a boy and the darkest human impulses, and now stood as a living reminder that courage comes in many forms, and that sometimes the truest sight belongs to those who see with their hearts. "We made it," Mason whispered to the horse, the words carrying across the peaceful evening air. "We both made it." Avalanche nickered softly in response, the sound like gentle affirmation floating on the summer breeze. And in that moment, as darkness settled around them, the white horse seemed to glow with an inner light. Not magic, but something equally powerful. The illumination of a promise kept, a life saved, and a future reclaimed from the edge of a frozen river. Dear listeners, we hope the story of Mason and Avalanche touched your hearts. If you want to keep experiencing stories like this one, make sure to subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and share in the comments what moved you the most. Here, every story is a reminder that love can conquer even the deepest darkness.